I was folding laundry in my quiet kitchen when Isabel's phone rang on the counter. "Your husband is gone, Rebecca. Stop calling me about family matters. 6 years I spent treating her like my own daughter. 6 years of Sunday dinners and birthday gifts." She grabbed her phone and walked toward the door without another word. I took a deep breath, but when I glanced at her screen, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The incoming call showed a name I recognized immediately. It was Roberto's number. My Roberto, who died 6 years ago. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. My hands were surprisingly steady as I processed what I'd just witnessed. There was something Isabel didn't know about her phone, something about those calls she'd been receiving. My name is Rebecca, and I was about to discover that some secrets refused to stay buried. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. Small details that suddenly seemed important. What I found would change everything I thought I knew about my late husband. Roberto's number burned in my memory like a brand. The same 10 digits I had dialed thousands of times over 32 years of marriage. The number I'd deleted from my phone 6 months after his funeral because seeing it there hurt too much. Yet there it was, glowing on Isabel's screen as her phone rang in my kitchen. I stood frozen by the counter, watching the call go to voicemail. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the device. Isabel had stepped outside to take a call on her work phone, leaving her personal phone behind. I knew her passcode. She'd used Emilio's birthday since he was born, never changing it even after Tomas had warned her about security. My finger hovered over the screen. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. This was invasion of privacy. This was wrong. But Roberto's number calling from beyond the grave wasn't rational either. Nothing about this moment made sense. I unlocked the phone. The missed call log showed 17 calls from Roberto's number over the past 3 weeks. 17 calls from a dead man to my daughter-in-law. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the list. Some calls lasted 5 minutes. Others went on for over an hour. The most recent was yesterday at 11 in the evening, long after Tomas had gone to bed. I opened the messages. What I found there shattered the last 6 years of my carefully constructed peace. "Missing you already, my love. Thursday can't come soon enough. R. The cabin feels empty without you. Bring that wine you like next time. R. Your mother-in-law suspects nothing. She's always been naive. R. Message after message, dating back 8 months. 8 months of secret communications with someone who signed himself as R. Someone who knew about our family dynamics. Someone who knew Isabel well enough to call her pet names I recognized. Names Roberto had whispered to her during family gatherings when he thought no one was looking. I scrolled further back, my heart pounding so hard I worried Isabel might hear it from outside. Photos appeared on the screen. Recent photos. Isabel laughing in what looked like a rustic kitchen. Isabel wearing a sundress I'd never seen before, standing on a wooden deck with mountains in the background. Isabel lying on what appeared to be a patchwork quilt, her hair spread across a pillow, smiling at whoever held the camera. But it was the last photo that made me grip the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. A man's hand reaching across a breakfast table to touch Isabel's fingers. The hand wore Roberto's wedding ring, the distinctive gold band with the small emerald chip that I'd helped him select for our 25th anniversary. The ring I'd buried with him 6 years ago. I heard Isabel's voice growing closer as she finished her call outside. My hands moved with surprising steadiness as I forwarded the most damning messages to my own phone, then quickly deleted the evidence of what I'd done. By the time she walked back into the kitchen, I was calmly wiping down the counter, her phone exactly where she'd left it. "Sorry about that," she said, tucking her work phone into her purse. "Client emergency." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She gathered her things, kissed my cheek with the same lips that had been whispering endearments to R, and left for home. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before I allowed myself to collapse into my kitchen chair. The messages I'd saved stared back at me from my own phone screen. Evidence of an affair that should have been impossible. Evidence that someone was using my dead husband's phone to seduce his son's wife. Evidence that the peaceful widow's life I'd built was constructed on lies. I thought about Roberto's final months, the way he'd grown distant, the mysterious Thursday appointments he claimed were doctor visits, but never brought home any paperwork. The new cologne I'd noticed but never questioned, the way he'd started password protecting his phone after 30 years of leaving it open between us. I remembered the Thursday before he died. He'd left the house at 2 in the afternoon, claiming he needed to pick up prescriptions. But when I'd called the pharmacy later to check on his medication schedule, they told me he hadn't been there in weeks. When he came home that evening, his shirt smelled like perfume. Not my perfume. I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. Roberto was grieving his brother's death the year before, I'd told myself. Men processed grief differently. Men sometimes became distant when facing their own mortality. I'd made excuses for every red flag because the alternative was too painful to consider. Now, staring at messages from beyond the grave, I realized how thoroughly I'd deceived myself. The next morning, I drove to Roberto's old office. The law firm had kept his private office sealed for 2 years after his death, finally cleaning it out only when the lease required renewal. But Tomas still had keys to the building. He'd kept them sentimentally, along with several boxes of his father's personal effects that he'd never had the heart to sort through. "Mom, what could you possibly need from Dad's old stuff?" Tomas asked when I called him at work. "Just some papers for the insurance company," I lied. "They're doing a final audit." Nothing important. He gave me the address of the storage unit where he'd moved everything. Unit 47 at Secure Storage on Pine Street, the same facility where we'd stored Christmas decorations and seasonal items for years. The storage unit smelled like dust and abandonment. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each labeled in Tomas's careful handwriting. Law books, client files, closed cases, personal items, Dad's desk, financial documents. I started with the personal items. Roberto's desk had been a massive oak piece with multiple drawers and hidden compartments. He'd been proud of its secret spaces, showing them to Emilio when he was young and swearing him to secrecy about Grandpa's treasure hiding places. In the bottom drawer, behind a false panel I'd forgotten existed, I found what I was looking for. A manila folder containing property deeds, utility bills, and insurance papers for an address I didn't recognize. 42 Pine Ridge Road, Mountain View. The papers were dated 3 years before Roberto's death. My hands shook as I photographed each document with my phone. The property had been purchased under Roberto's name alone. The utility bills showed regular usage through the month he died, then a gap, then resumed activity starting 8 months ago, exactly when the messages between Isabel and R had begun. I drove home and researched the address online. Pine Ridge Road was near Lake Arareco, about 2 hours from the city. The satellite images showed a wooded area with scattered cabins and private homes, vacation rentals and weekend retreats for people who wanted to escape the city. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. Roberto had owned a secret property. Someone was using that property now. Someone with access to Roberto's phone, his belongings, possibly even his identity documents. Someone who knew Isabel intimately enough to continue an affair that had apparently started while Roberto was alive. I spent 3 days planning my trip to the cabin. I told Tomas I was visiting my sister in Denver for the weekend. I rented a car instead of using my own, paying cash and using my maiden name. I packed surveillance equipment I'd ordered online using overnight shipping. A small wireless camera with motion detection, a telephoto lens for my camera, even a GPS tracker that I could place on Isabel's car if needed. The drive to Mountain View took me through winding mountain roads I'd never traveled. Roberto had always claimed he hated mountain driving, that the elevation changes gave him headaches. Another lie to add to the growing collection. 42 Pine Ridge Road sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. The cabin itself was modest but well-maintained. Cedar siding, stone chimney, wraparound porch with comfortable-looking furniture. It looked like the kind of place where people went to disappear from their regular lives. I parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, staying hidden in the tree line. The cabin appeared empty, but there were recent signs of occupancy, fresh tire tracks in the gravel, a newspaper on the porch dated 3 days ago, curtains drawn, but pulled slightly aside as if someone had been watching the driveway. The front door was locked, but I found an unlocked window on the side of the cabin. My hands surprised me with their steadiness as I pushed it open and climbed inside. I hadn't broken into anywhere since I was a teenager, but the skills apparently never disappeared entirely. The interior made my chest tight with recognition. Roberto's favorite coffee mug sat in the kitchen sink. His reading glasses lay folded on the kitchen table next to a newspaper crossword puzzle, half completed in his distinctive handwriting. The couch held throw pillows I'd given him for Christmas 2 years before his death. Pillows I thought he donated to charity because they'd disappeared from our house. But it was the bedroom that destroyed me completely. The bed was unmade, showing evidence of recent use. 2 sets of clothes were scattered on the floor. Women's clothing I recognized as Isabel's, mixed with men's clothing that could have come from Roberto's closet. The dresser held framed photographs that made me physically nauseous. Isabel and a man whose face was turned away from the camera, walking hand in hand along the lake shore. Isabel laughing at a restaurant table across from someone whose hand was visible, but whose features were cropped out of the frame. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, I found Roberto's passport, his social security card, his driver's license, somehow renewed 2 years after his death, his credit cards, which I'd assumed had been canceled, bank statements for accounts I'd never known existed, showing regular activity through the present month. Either my husband had faked his own death, or someone was using his identity with sophisticated thoroughness. I installed the wireless camera in the living room, hidden behind books on a shelf that faced the main seating area. The device connected to an app on my phone, promising to alert me whenever motion was detected. I positioned it carefully to capture faces while remaining invisible to casual observation. Then I drove home and waited. The first alert came 3 days later, Tuesday afternoon, 2:15. My phone buzzed with a notification from the hidden camera. I opened the app and watched live footage of Isabel entering the cabin. She moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who'd been there many times. She set groceries on the kitchen counter, put flowers in a vase, opened wine to let it breathe. She was preparing for someone's arrival. An hour later, a man entered the frame. My heart stopped beating for several seconds as I stared at the screen. The man was Roberto. Not someone who looked like Roberto. Not someone who resembled Roberto. The man moving through my husband's secret cabin was Roberto himself, 6 years after I'd watched his coffin lowered into the ground. He moved with Roberto's distinctive gait, slightly favoring his left leg from an old football injury. He held his shoulders with Roberto's particular slouch. When he turned toward the camera, I could see Roberto's face. Older, perhaps, maybe thinner than I remembered. But unmistakably, the man I'd been married to for 3 decades. I watched through tears as he embraced Isabel with obvious intimacy. I watched him pour wine into 2 glasses with hands I'd held thousands of times. I watched him kiss her with lips that had promised to love me until death parted us. Death had not parted us. Death had freed him to pursue the life he'd apparently wanted all along. I sat in my living room for 6 hours, watching the live feed of my husband's betrayal play out in real time. They cooked dinner together. They sat on the couch I'd helped him choose, talking and laughing about things I couldn't hear. They disappeared into the bedroom around 10:30. The camera kept recording their presence through the night. Motion alerts continued until morning, when they finally left together in Isabel's car. I had evidence now, proof that Roberto was alive, Proof that he and Isabel had been conducting an affair for years, possibly throughout the entire duration of his marriage to me. Proof that his death had been staged, his funeral a performance, his burial a lie. But proof of what, exactly? That my husband had committed fraud? That my daughter-in-law was complicit in that fraud? That my son's marriage was built on deception? That my grandson's family was a carefully constructed illusion? What was I supposed to do with this information? I could call the police, but what crime would I report? Insurance fraud, certainly. Identity theft, possibly bigamy, if Roberto and Isabel had married under false pretenses. But pursuing those charges would destroy Tomas and Emilio. It would turn our family tragedy into a public scandal. It would strip away every comfort my son had built around his father's memory. I could confront Tomas directly, but how could I explain my surveillance activities? How could I tell my son that his wife was having an affair with his supposedly dead father? How could I expect him to believe something so impossible without seeming like I'd lost my mind? I could confront Isabel, but she'd had years to perfect her deception. She would deny everything, claim the photos were fake, insist I was suffering from grief-induced delusions. She had Roberto to back up her story, assuming he was willing to risk exposure. Or I could confront Roberto directly. The thought of seeing him face to face terrified and enraged me in equal measure. What would I say to the man who'd let me grieve his death for 6 years? What words existed for that level of betrayal? But it was the only approach that might get me answers. The only way to understand why he'd destroyed our family for a fantasy life with our daughter-in-law. I returned to the cabin on Thursday afternoon, the next time the couple was scheduled to meet, according to the message pattern I'd observed. I parked openly in the driveway this time. No more hiding, no more surveillance from a distance. If Roberto was alive, he would face me directly. Isabel's car was already there when I arrived. Through the window, I could see them sitting at the kitchen table, sharing lunch and conversation like any ordinary couple. The domesticity of the scene made me furious. They looked happy, relaxed, completely comfortable in their stolen life. I walked up to the front door and knocked firmly. The conversation inside stopped immediately. I heard footsteps approaching, then Isabel's voice, cautious and confused. "Who is it?" "Your mother-in-law," I said clearly. "We need to talk." Silence stretched for nearly a minute. I heard whispered conversation, but couldn't make out words. Finally, the door opened. Isabel stood in the doorway, blocking my view of the interior. Her face was pale but composed. She'd had years to prepare for this possibility. "Rebecca," she said calmly, "what are you doing here?" "I think you know exactly why I'm here." She studied my face for several seconds, clearly calculating her options. Finally, she stepped aside and let me enter. Roberto sat at the kitchen table, exactly as I'd seen him through the camera feed. But seeing him in person, breathing and solid and undeniably real, felt like being struck by lightning. He looked older than he should have. His hair had gone completely gray and he'd lost weight. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at me across the breakfast table for 30 years. "Hello, Rebecca," he said quietly. "Hello, Roberto." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "You look remarkably good for a dead man." He had the grace to flinch at that. Isabel remained standing by the door, as if ready to bolt or block my exit. The three of us formed a tense triangle in the small cabin kitchen. "You must have questions," Roberto said. "I have more questions than you could answer in a lifetime," I replied. "But let's start with the obvious ones. Are you actually Roberto Martinez, my legal husband, or are you someone else wearing his identity?" "I'm Roberto's twin brother," he said. "My name is Ricardo." The words hit me like a physical blow. Twin brother. Roberto had never mentioned a twin brother. In 32 years of marriage, through countless conversations about family and childhood and history, he had never once mentioned having a twin. "That's impossible," I said. "Roberto was an only child. His parents told me he was their only child." "Roberto was raised as an only child," Ricardo continued. "I was given up for adoption at birth. We didn't find each other until 5 years before he died." Isabel finally moved away from the door, taking a seat at the table across from both of us. She looked exhausted, as if this conversation had been inevitable but dreaded. "Ricardo is telling the truth," she said quietly. "Roberto found him through a medical registry. Roberto needed a bone marrow transplant. That's how they discovered each other. The bone marrow transplant. Roberto's mysterious medical appointments. The hospital visits he'd always attended alone, claiming he didn't want to worry me with technical details. I'd assumed they were routine tests related to his heart condition. "So you met Roberto when he was sick," I said to Ricardo, "and you donated bone marrow to save his life." "Yes," Ricardo nodded. "The transplant was successful. It gave Roberto 3 more years than he would have had otherwise. 3 years he spent planning to abandon his family." "It wasn't like that," Isabel said quickly. "Roberto loved you. He loved Tomas and Emilio, but he also fell in love with me. And you fell in love with him while married to his son." She had the decency to look ashamed. "It wasn't planned. It just happened gradually. Roberto and I spent a lot of time together while Tomas was traveling for work. He was helping with Emilio, coming to school events, being present in ways Tomas couldn't because of his schedule. So you decided to steal my husband." "Nobody stole anybody," Ricardo interrupted. "Roberto made his own choices. He asked me to help him disappear because he couldn't bear to hurt you and Tomas with the truth about his feelings." "His feelings," I repeated. "His feelings were more important than my right to know the truth about my own marriage." "Roberto died of a heart attack," Isabel said. "Right here in this cabin. I was with him when it happened. We'd come here to talk about telling you and Tomas the truth about our relationship." "How convenient." "It's not convenient," she snapped. "It's devastating. Roberto died before we could make things right, before he could explain his feelings or ask for forgiveness or figure out how to handle the situation fairly. So you decided to handle it by faking his identity and continuing your affair with his twin brother." Ricardo and Isabel exchanged a look that confirmed my suspicions. "Ricardo and I fell in love while planning Roberto's memorial service," Isabel said. "We were both grieving. We found comfort in each other. When we realized how much we meant to each other, Ricardo suggested we use the identity switch plan that he and Roberto had discussed." Identity switch plan. Roberto had been setting up a parallel identity for Ricardo, she explained. Legal documents, financial accounts, property ownership. The idea was that if Roberto ever decided to leave his marriage, Ricardo would assume his identity completely while Roberto started over with a clean slate. "But Roberto died before the switch could happen," Ricardo continued. "So Isabel and I decided to implement the plan anyway. She would divorce Tomas amicably, claiming incompatibility. Then she would start a relationship with me, using Roberto's established identity. And I would never know the difference because I'd never met Ricardo. We never intended to deceive you permanently," Isabel said. "The plan was to wait until Emilio was older, then gradually introduce Ricardo as Isabel's new boyfriend, someone who happened to resemble Roberto, but was obviously a different person." "Obviously different how?" "Different personality, different interests, different mannerisms." Ricardo spoke up. "Roberto and I may have looked identical, but we were raised in completely different environments. Our personalities are actually quite distinct." I studied his face as he spoke. Now that I knew to look for differences, I could see them. Ricardo's expressions were subtly different from Roberto's. His posture was straighter. His voice had a different cadence. He gestured more with his hands when he talked. "But you've been using Roberto's identity for 6 years," I said. His social security number, his credit cards, his driver's license. We never touched the insurance money, Ricardo said quickly. That all went to you and Tomas, exactly as it should have. We only used accounts that Roberto had established specifically for this arrangement. Money he'd saved separately over several years. Money he stole from our joint accounts. Money he earned and chose to allocate differently, Isabel corrected. Roberto never took money that was rightfully yours. I laughed bitterly. Everything Roberto earned during our marriage was rightfully mine. That's how marriage works. Community property. They didn't have an answer for that. Show me Roberto's death certificate, I said. Show me medical records from his heart attack. Show me something that proves he actually died. Isabel and Ricardo exchanged another look. Then Isabel disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a manila folder. She handed me a death certificate issued by Mountain View General Hospital, signed by Dr. Patricia Williams, dated 6 years and 4 months ago. Dr. Williams is a friend of Ricardo's, Isabel explained. She was willing to issue the certificate based on Ricardo's medical power of attorney for Roberto. So the death certificate is fraudulent. The death is real, Ricardo said firmly. Roberto did die of a heart attack. Dr. Williams examined his body. The certificate reflects the actual cause and time of death. Then where is Roberto buried? Another silence. He was cremated, Isabel said finally, according to his written wishes. Ricardo scattered his ashes at the lake. I felt dizzy. Everything I'd believed about Roberto's death, his funeral, his burial, was fabricated. The casket I'd wept over was empty. The grave I'd visited every year contained nothing. The man I'd mourned was actually alive and planning his escape while I grieved. You let me plan a funeral for an empty casket, I said. Roberto wanted you to have closure, Ricardo said. He wanted you to be able to say goodbye in a way that felt real and meaningful. By lying to me. By protecting you from the knowledge that he wanted to leave. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I needed air. I needed space to think. I needed to be away from these people and their justifications and their carefully constructed deceptions. I need to understand something, I said. Are you planning to continue this charade indefinitely? We're planning to live our lives, Isabel said, quietly and privately. We're not hurting anyone. You're not hurting anyone? I stared at her in disbelief. You're lying to your son every day. You're lying to your grandson. You're lying to everyone who cares about this family. We're protecting them from unnecessary pain. You're protecting yourselves from consequences. Ricardo stood up and walked to the window overlooking the lake. With his back to me, he spoke quietly. What do you want from us, Rebecca? What would satisfy you? It was a fair question. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Truth? All of those things seemed both crucial and impossible. I want you to disappear, I said finally, both of you. I want you to take this sick fantasy and move somewhere far away where you can't contaminate my family anymore. Emilio needs his mother, Isabel said. I won't abandon my son. You already abandoned your son when you chose to betray his father. Tomas and I are getting divorced anyway. It has nothing to do with Ricardo. Everything you do has to do with Ricardo. Your entire relationship with Tomas has been poisoned by Ricardo. Your entire relationship with Emilio is built on lies. Then what do you suggest? Isabel's voice was rising. Should I tell Emilio that his grandfather faked his death to run away with me? Should I tell Tomas that his father was planning to abandon his family? Should I destroy every happy memory they have of Roberto just to satisfy your need for honesty? She had a point, and I hated her for it. The truth would devastate Tomas and Emilio. It would rewrite their entire understanding of their family history. It would turn their grief into humiliation and their love into betrayal. But lies had consequences too. Lies created foundations that could crumble without warning. Lies trapped people in relationships and realities they couldn't understand or navigate honestly. I want you to stay away from Tomas and Emilio, I said to Ricardo. Whatever identity you use, whatever name you call yourself, I want you to have no contact with my family. That's not realistic, Isabel said. Ricardo is my partner. If I'm going to maintain a relationship with Emilio, Ricardo will be part of our lives. Then you need to choose your relationship with Emilio or your relationship with Ricardo. I'm not choosing between my son and my partner. You already chose. You chose when you started sleeping with your husband's father. The words hung in the air like poison. Isabel flinched as if I'd slapped her. Ricardo turned back from the window, his face hard. Roberto was never a father to Emilio, he said. He was a grandfather. And he was a grandfather who was planning to leave his family anyway. Because of her, I pointed at Isabel. Because she seduced him. Because he fell in love, Isabel snapped. Because sometimes people fall in love with someone other than their spouse. It happens in every family. It's happened throughout history. The only difference is that Roberto found a way to spare you the humiliation of a public affair and messy divorce. He spared me nothing. He took away my right to make informed decisions about my own life. What decisions would you have made? Ricardo asked. If Roberto had told you he was in love with Isabel, what would you have done? I thought about it honestly. If Roberto had come to me 6 years ago and confessed his feelings, what would my response have been? I would have fought for my marriage. I would have insisted on counseling. I would have demanded that he end all contact with Isabel immediately. I would have made it as difficult as possible for him to leave, using guilt and obligation and shared history as weapons to keep him bound to me. I would have made everyone miserable in service of preserving a marriage that one partner desperately wanted to escape. I would have tried to save my marriage, I said, even if Roberto didn't want it saved. Even then. So Roberto's choice was to stay in a marriage he didn't want, or hurt you by leaving openly, or find a way to leave that minimized the damage to everyone involved. His choice was to honor the promises he made when he married me. People change, Isabel said. Feelings change. Roberto tried to honor his promises for over 30 years. When he couldn't do it anymore, he tried to find the least harmful way to end things, by faking his own death, by disappearing quietly, instead of creating a scandal that would have destroyed multiple relationships and traumatized his grandchild. I wanted to argue with her logic, but I could see the reasoning behind their choices. Twisted reasoning, perhaps. Selfish reasoning, but not entirely irrational reasoning. So, what happens now? I asked. Do we all pretend this conversation never happened? Do I go home and act like I don't know that my husband faked his death to run away with my daughter-in-law? We go on living our lives, Ricardo said. Isabel and Tomas finalized their divorce. Isabel and I move somewhere quieter. You continue taking care of your family. And Emilio? Emilio visits his mother according to whatever custody arrangement she and Tomas agree on, Isabel said. He gets to know Ricardo gradually, as my boyfriend. Eventually, if we decide to marry, Ricardo becomes his stepfather. His step-grandfather, you mean? His stepfather, Isabel corrected firmly. Ricardo is not Roberto. Whatever relationship Ricardo builds with Emilio will be his own relationship, not an extension of Roberto's. It was a neat solution to an impossible problem, but it required my silence. It required my complicity in maintaining their deception. It required me to become another conspirator in the web of lies that held their fantasy together. What if I refuse to keep your secret? I asked. What if I tell Tomas everything? Then you'll destroy his relationship with his father's memory, his relationship with his son's mother, and his son's relationship with his mother, Isabel said. You'll turn Emilio against me and leave him without any maternal support during his parents' divorce. You'll create a scandal that will follow your family for years, but everyone will know the truth. Everyone will know a truth that helps no one and hurts everyone. I stood in the cabin kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, faced with an impossible choice. I could expose their deception and watch it destroy my family, or I could become complicit in their lies and watch them slowly eat away at everything I'd tried to protect. Neither option felt like justice. Neither option felt like victory. Both options required sacrifices I wasn't sure I could make. "I need time to think," I said finally. "How much time?" Ricardo asked. "I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe months." "We can't wait indefinitely," Isabel said. "Tomas is already asking questions about the divorce. He wants to understand why I'm ending our marriage when everything seemed fine." "Everything wasn't fine. Your marriage was built on lies. My marriage was built on love and commitment. It ended because I fell in love with someone else. That happens to people every day. It doesn't happen with dead fathers-in-law. It happened with Ricardo." Who happens to be Roberto's brother? The family connection is a complication, but it's not the core issue. I walked to the door, then turned back to look at them. They stood close together, united in their deception, presenting a front of solidarity that I couldn't break through with arguments or anger. "If I agree to keep your secret," I said, "I want conditions." "What conditions?" Ricardo asked. "You move away. Not next state, not next county. Far away. You build your life somewhere that has no connection to our family or our community." "That's reasonable," Isabel said. "You limit contact with Emilio to holidays and special occasions. No regular visitation, no weekly phone calls. You don't try to maintain a close mother-son relationship that requires constant deception." "That's not reasonable," Isabel said immediately. "Emilio is my son. Emilio is the son you betrayed when you chose to have an affair with his grandfather. Ricardo is not his grandfather. Ricardo is genetically identical to his grandfather. Ricardo is using his grandfather's identity. To Emilio, Ricardo is his grandfather, whether you admit it or not." Isabel and Ricardo exchanged a look that told me they'd already considered this problem. "We can handle that carefully," Ricardo said. "We can make sure Emilio understands that I'm a different person." "How? By teaching him to lie about your identity? By making him complicit in your deception?" "By introducing me as Ricardo from the beginning," he said, "using my real name, not Roberto's. But you've been using Roberto's identity for financial purposes. You've been living in Roberto's house, using Roberto's credit cards, holding Roberto's driver's license. We can change that. We can establish separate identities going forward. After 6 years of fraud. After 6 years of privacy," Isabel corrected. "We never defrauded anyone. We never collected money that didn't belong to us. We simply maintained the fiction that Roberto was dead so we could be together without scandal." I realized we were going in circles. Every argument I made, they had an answer for. Every objection I raised, they'd already considered and planned around. They'd had 6 years to perfect their story and 6 years to convince themselves it was justifiable. "I'll give you my answer in 1 week," I said. "Next Thursday, I'll come back here and tell you what I've decided." "And if you decide to expose us?" Ricardo asked. "Then I expose you. And we all live with the consequences." I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with everything I'd learned. Roberto was dead but also alive. My marriage had been honest, but also fraudulent. Isabel was a victim of circumstance, but also a calculating manipulator. The truth was both essential and destructive. By the time I reached my driveway, I knew what I had to do. I spent the week researching private investigators, divorce attorneys, and fraud specialists. I documented everything I'd discovered, photographing the cabin, the evidence, the messages on Isabel's phone. I prepared 2 different plans for 2 different choices. Plan A: expose everything. Hire a private investigator to gather additional evidence. Consult with an attorney about legal options for insurance fraud and identity theft. Prepare Tomas and Emilio for the devastating truth about their family. Plan B. Become complicit. Help Ricardo and Isabel disappear cleanly. Maintain their secret while protecting Tomas and Emilio from unnecessary trauma. Sacrifice my own need for justice in service of family stability. I chose Plan B, not because I forgave them, not because I understood their choices, not because I thought they deserved protection. I chose Plan B because exposing the truth would hurt Tomas and Emilio more than it would hurt Ricardo and Isabel. The people who deserved punishment were the people most capable of surviving it. The people who deserved protection were the people most vulnerable to destruction. When I returned to the cabin the following Thursday, I brought a written agreement. You move to another state within 60 days, I read aloud. You establish completely separate identities from Roberto's. You limit contact with Emilio to major holidays and significant events, with at least 30 days' notice to Tomas before any visits. You never, under any circumstances, reveal your connection to Roberto or discuss Roberto's death with Emilio. And if you ever violate these conditions, I will expose everything immediately, regardless of the consequences to my family. Isabel and Ricardo read the agreement carefully, discussing certain clauses in whispers. Finally, they both signed it. "Why are you doing this?" Isabel asked as she handed back the papers. "Because Emilio doesn't deserve to pay for your choices," I said, "and because Tomas doesn't deserve to have his memories of his father destroyed by your selfishness. And because you don't want to deal with the scandal," Ricardo added. He wasn't wrong. I didn't want to be the widow whose husband faked his death to run away. I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who exposed her son's wife's affair. I didn't want to be the grandmother who destroyed her grandson's family in service of abstract principles like honesty and justice. I wanted to be the woman who protected her family from unnecessary pain, even when that protection required complicity in lies. "Yes," I admitted, "I don't want to deal with the scandal." They moved to Colorado 6 weeks later. Isabel told Tomas she needed a fresh start after the divorce, somewhere with mountains and clean air and new opportunities. Tomas helped her pack, kissed her goodbye, and promised that Emilio could visit whenever he wanted. The divorce was finalized 3 months after that. Amicable and straightforward. No contested assets, no custody battles, no public drama. Just 2 people who had grown apart and decided to end their marriage peacefully. Tomas moved back into my house temporarily, bringing Emilio with him. We became a 3-generation household again, grandmothers and fathers and grandchildren sharing morning coffee and evening homework sessions. It felt natural and comfortable in ways I hadn't expected. Isabel called Emilio twice a week initially, then once a week, then every other week, as he became more involved in school activities and friendships. She visited for his birthday and Christmas, bringing Ricardo as her boyfriend. Ricardo was polite and distant with the family, friendly enough to avoid suspicion, but not warm enough to encourage closeness. Emilio liked Ricardo well enough, but he didn't seek out a relationship with him. To Emilio, Ricardo was just his mother's boyfriend, a nice enough man who happened to resemble his deceased grandfather, but was obviously a different person, with different interests and mannerisms. The resemblance was noted, but not dwelt upon. Tomas mentioned it once, commenting that Ricardo looked like he could be related to Dad, but he didn't pursue the observation. Physical resemblances between strangers were common enough not to require explanation. 2 years after the divorce, Tomas started dating a colleague from his law firm. Sarah was a family attorney, recently widowed herself, with 2 teenage daughters from her previous marriage. She understood the complexities of blended families and the importance of moving slowly when children were involved. Tomas and Sarah married 18 months later, in a small ceremony in my backyard. Emilio walked his father down the aisle, proud and serious in his first real suit. Sarah's daughters served as bridesmaids. I gained 2 new granddaughters and a daughter-in-law who brought lightness and laughter back into our family. Isabel sent a congratulations card, but didn't attend the wedding. She and Ricardo had moved again, this time to Arizona, where Ricardo had found work in construction, and Isabel was taking online courses in graphic design. They seemed to be building a quiet life together, far from the complications of our shared history. Emilio's relationship with his mother continued but evolved. He spent 2 weeks with her each summer, usually in July when school was out. He called her on Mother's Day and her birthday, but his primary family remained in our house, with his father and stepmother and stepsisters and me. I kept the secret for 7 years. 7 years of family dinners where I smiled and laughed and played the role of the devoted widow and grandmother. 7 years of watching Tomas rebuild his life without knowing how thoroughly his first wife had betrayed him. 7 years of helping Emilio with homework and school projects while hiding the truth about his mother's affair with his grandfather's twin. The secret became easier to carry over time, but it never became light. It sat in my chest like a stone, cold and heavy and always present. There were moments when I almost told Tomas everything. Moments when I caught him looking wistful about his father, or when he made comments about the importance of honesty in marriage, or when he praised Isabel for handling their divorce so maturely. But I kept my silence because the alternative still seemed worse. Tomas was happy with Sarah. Emilio was thriving in school and developing into a thoughtful, confident young man. Our family had healed from the disruption of divorce and remarriage. Why destroy that peace for the sake of truth that would help no one? Last month, Emilio turned 16. Isabel came for his birthday party, as agreed, bringing Ricardo and a carefully chosen gift that showed she'd been paying attention to her son's interests. They stayed for the weekend, sleeping in the guest room that had once been Roberto's office. During the party, Sarah's oldest daughter mentioned that Ricardo looked familiar, like someone she'd seen in old family photos. Tomas laughed and said he'd noticed the resemblance too, that Ricardo could be Roberto's younger brother if Roberto had had any siblings. Maybe you're related somehow, Sarah suggested lightly. Distant cousins or something. Families have all sorts of connections they don't know about. Ricardo smiled and nodded, playing along with the casual speculation. It's possible. My adoption records are sealed, so I don't know much about my birth family's history. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I watched Ricardo carefully for the rest of the evening. He was comfortable with the family resemblance being noticed and discussed. He'd prepared explanations that satisfied curiosity without revealing truth. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Ricardo sitting alone on the back porch, looking out at the garden Roberto had planted years earlier. "It's harder than you expected, isn't it?" I said, joining him on the porch swing. "What is?" "Living with his identity, being around his family, pretending you're someone else." Ricardo was quiet for several minutes. Then he said, "I dream about him sometimes." "Roberto, we'll be having conversations about things that happened before I knew him existed. In the dreams, I know things about your family that I learned from Isabel, but I experience them as if I lived them myself. That sounds disturbing? It is. Sometimes I wake up confused about which memories are mine and which are his. Sometimes I catch myself responding to situations the way I think Roberto would have responded instead of the way I actually feel." "Do you regret the choice you made?" "I regret a lot of things," he said. "I regret that Roberto died before he could make peace with his family. I regret that Isabel and I fell in love in such complicated circumstances. I regret that you've had to carry this secret alone." "But do you regret being with Isabel?" "No," he said immediately. "I love Isabel. I love the life we've built together. I just wish we could have built it without so many lies." "You still could," I said. "You could tell Tomas the truth." You could introduce yourself as Ricardo instead of continuing to use Roberto's identity, and destroy Emilio's relationship with his mother, and traumatize Tomas with the knowledge that his father wanted to abandon the family, and turn you into someone who's been lying to her family for 7 years? He was right. The moment for clean truth had passed years earlier. Now truth would be complicated by years of deception, making everyone complicit in the lies that had protected them. Besides, Ricardo continued, I'm not sure Tomas would believe the truth even if we told him. The story is too strange, too complicated. He might assume we were making it up to cover some other deception. What other deception? That Isabel and I started our affair while Roberto was alive, that we killed Roberto to be together, that we've been stealing money from the family. People's imaginations can be more damaging than reality when they're trying to make sense of impossible situations. I hadn't considered that possibility. If the truth came out badly, if it came out in fragments or without proper context, it could lead to suspicions far worse than the reality. So we're all trapped, I said. You're trapped in Roberto's identity. Isabel's trapped in a relationship built on lies. I'm trapped keeping secrets that aren't mine. And Tomas and Emilio are trapped in a family built on deception they don't even know about. Maybe, Ricardo said. Or maybe we're all protected by the same lies that trap us. Maybe some truths are too complicated for real life. Before he and Isabel left the next morning, Ricardo handed me a letter. Don't read it now, he said. Read it when you need to remember why we made these choices. I waited until they'd driven away, until Tomas and Sarah had taken the kids to school, until I was alone in my kitchen with my coffee and my thoughts. Then I opened Ricardo's letter. Rebecca, it began, I've never been able to apologize properly for the pain our choices have caused you. Not because I don't feel sorry, but because words seem inadequate for something this complicated. I want you to know that Roberto talked about you constantly during the months we spent together. He talked about your kindness, your strength, your dedication to the family. He talked about feeling guilty for wanting something different from the life you'd built together. He never stopped loving you. He just also started loving Isabel. Roberto was trying to find a way to leave that wouldn't destroy you. The identity switch plan wasn't about deception for its own sake. It was about giving you a version of events that you could live with, that would preserve your dignity and your standing in the community. Roberto wanted you to be the widow of a beloved man, not the abandoned wife of an unfaithful husband. He wanted Tomas to remember his father as someone who died tragically, not someone who left voluntarily. He wanted Emilio to grow up with positive memories of his grandfather, not the knowledge that his grandfather had chosen another family over his own. I know this doesn't justify what we've done. I know it doesn't erase the betrayal or the lies or the pain we've caused, but I hope it helps you understand that our choices came from love, not cruelty. Isabel and I are happy together, but we're not happy about the circumstances that brought us together. We carry the weight of these secrets every day. We live with the knowledge that our happiness came at the cost of truth and trust in your family. I hope someday you can find peace with what we've done. I hope Tomas and Emilio never have to carry the burdens we've placed on your shoulders. And I hope you know that your discretion and sacrifice have protected the people you love most, even when protecting them required tremendous personal cost. We will continue to live quietly and honor the boundaries you've set. If you ever decide that the truth needs to come out, we will support whatever story you choose to tell. We owe you that much and more. Thank you for choosing your family's peace over your own need for justice. Thank you for being stronger than any of us deserved. With respect and gratitude, Ricardo. I folded the letter and put it in the box where I kept important papers. Then I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the morning light move across Roberto's garden. The garden needed pruning. The roses were overgrown, and the vegetable plot had been taken over by weeds. I'd let it go wild after Roberto's death, unable to maintain something that reminded me so strongly of him. But maybe it was time to reclaim the garden. Maybe it was time to make it mine, to plant things I wanted to grow, to create something new from the foundation he'd left behind. I put on my gardening gloves and went outside. The work felt good, physical and immediate and constructive. I pulled weeds and dead-headed flowers and pruned back the overgrowth that had accumulated during years of benign neglect. By afternoon, I could see the garden's bones again, its potential for new growth and different beauty. Tomas found me there when he came home from work. "The garden looks amazing, Mom," he said. "Dad would be proud." I looked up at my son, dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my forehead, surrounded by the evidence of a day's honest work. "I think your father would want me to be happy," I said, "even if that means changing things he created. He always said the garden was yours as much as his." "Did he?" I couldn't remember Roberto ever saying that, but then there were probably many things Roberto had said that I'd forgotten over the years. Memory was selective, keeping some things and discarding others according to its own mysterious logic. "He used to say that the garden was just a framework," Tomas continued, "that the real beauty came from the person tending it." That sounded like something Roberto might have said, philosophical and slightly romantic, the kind of observation he'd make while we worked together on weekend mornings. "Maybe I'll plant some different vegetables next year," I said. "Maybe some flowers he never tried." "That sounds perfect." As the sun set, I cleaned my tools and went inside to make dinner for my family. Tomas and Sarah and the girls would be hungry, and Emilio had homework that would require supervision. There were ordinary tasks waiting, ordinary responsibilities that anchored me to the present instead of the past. I cooked dinner and helped with homework and listened to stories about everyone's day. I participated in the comfortable rhythms of family life, carrying my secrets quietly and finding small moments of genuine happiness despite the weight I carried. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the garden. In the moonlight, it looked peaceful and orderly, ready for whatever I chose to plant there. I thought about Roberto, wherever he was now. Not the Roberto who had planned to leave me, but the Roberto who had planted roses and taught his grandson to identify different types of birds and kissed me goodnight for 30 years. People were complicated. Marriages were complicated. Families were complicated. Truth was complicated. Maybe accepting that complexity was its own form of peace. I turned away from the window and went to bed, ready to sleep without dreams of the past, and wake up ready to tend the garden I was still growing. Sometimes the hardest choice is protecting the people we love from truths that would only bring them pain, even when carrying those secrets weighs heavy on our hearts. And that was today's story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe here. There are many more stories like this to come.